The Galactic Military Academy on Zentera Prime had seen many species walk through its halls over the past 3 centuries. Tall, crystalline Vorthak with their razor-sharp intellect. The six-armed Nexari who could operate multiple weapon systems simultaneously. The heavily armored Corvin whose natural shells could deflect plasma bolts. But never had they seen anything quite like the human who sat in the back row of advanced weapons theory. Marcus Chen looked completely ordinary by human standards. Average height, black hair that never seemed to stay properly combed, and brown eyes that carried a perpetual glint of curiosity. To his alien classmates, however, he was a walking contradiction. Humans had only joined the Galactic Federation 15 years ago, and their reputation preceded them in the strangest ways. They were called Deathworlders, a species that had evolved on a planet so hostile that it had produced beings of remarkable adaptability and resilience. Yet Marcus didn't look particularly dangerous. He wore the standard Academy uniform, took notes with an old-fashioned pen and paper instead of a neural interface, and had a habit of asking questions that made his professors pause and think. Professor Kethvar stood at the front of the classroom, his four arms gesturing gracefully as he explained the principles of energy weapon efficiency. The Vorthak's crystalline body caught the artificial sunlight streaming through the windows, casting rainbow patterns across the walls. His voice resonated with the authority of someone who had spent decades studying the art of warfare. The key to understanding modern combat, Kethvar said, his words translated automatically by the Universal Communication System, lies in recognizing that technology has rendered primitive weapons obsolete. A plasma rifle can punch through 3 meters of reinforced durasteel. A graviton cannon can collapse molecular bonds from a kilometer away. These are the tools of civilized warfare. A Nexari student raised 2 of her arms. Professor, what about the humans' chemical propellant weapons? They're bullets, as they call them. Kethvar's crystalline features shifted in what might have been amusement. An interesting historical curiosity, Zarath. Human kinetic weapons were indeed effective against unshielded targets on their homeworld. However, they pale in comparison to modern energy-based systems. A simple personal shield generator renders such weapons useless. Marcus felt the familiar weight of attention as every head in the classroom turned toward him. It happened often. As the only human in most of his classes, he had become an unofficial representative of his entire species. The pressure was both flattering and exhausting. Is there something you'd like to add, Cadet Chun? Kethvar asked. His tone wasn't unkind, but there was a subtle challenge in it. Marcus set down his pen and looked up. I was just wondering about the assumptions we're making, sir. You're absolutely right that energy weapons are more powerful than kinetic ones. But warfare isn't just about raw power, is it? The professor's 4 eyes focused on Marcus with sudden intensity. Explain. Well, Marcus said, glancing around the room at his classmates, we're assuming that advanced technology will always be available. That power sources won't fail, that manufacturing chains won't be disrupted, that sophisticated targeting systems won't be jammed or hacked. A Corvin student named Thakmar, whose shell was decorated with the scars of ceremonial combat, made a dismissive sound. Are you suggesting that primitive weapons have a place in modern warfare? That's like saying we should travel between stars with chemical rockets instead of quantum drives. Marcus shook his head. I'm not saying primitive weapons are better. I'm saying that adaptability might be more important than we think. What happens when your plasma rifle's power cell dies and you're stranded on a planet with no advanced infrastructure? You call for extraction, said another student, a bird-like screech whose feathers ruffled with amusement. What if you can't? Marcus countered. What if the enemy has jammed communications, or destroyed your ship, or you're behind enemy lines? Professor Kethvar raised one of his hands for silence. This is an interesting philosophical discussion, Cadet Chun, but let's not lose sight of practical realities. The likelihood of a modern soldier finding themselves without proper equipment is vanishingly small. Federation logistics are the most advanced in the galaxy. Marcus nodded respectfully. Of course, sir. I'm just thinking about edge cases. My species has a saying, Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Paranoia is hardly a virtue, Thakmar rumbled. The Corvin Way teaches that superior equipment and training are the foundations of victory. With respect, Marcus said, paranoia is why my species survived long enough to reach the stars. The classroom fell silent. It was an uncomfortable truth that hung in the air like smoke. Earth was indeed a death world, a planet where everything from the weather to the wildlife to the microbial life had been actively trying to kill humanity for millions of years. They had survived ice ages, supervolcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, and countless wars among themselves. They were the only species in known galactic history to have developed space travel while still hosting multiple competing civilizations on their homeworld. Professor Kethvar's crystalline form shifted slightly, a sign of discomfort. I think we're straying from the lesson plan. Perhaps we should focus on the practical applications of modern weapon systems. Actually, came a new voice from the doorway. I think this conversation is exactly what we need. Every head turned to see General Varix enter the room. The old Vorthak was a legend in military circles, having served in 3 major conflicts and countless smaller engagements. His crystalline body bore the clouded scars of battle, and his presence commanded instant respect from everyone present. Professor Ketvar Imedat Elistrait Nid. General, we weren't expecting, I know, Varix said, moving to the front of the room with the measured gait of someone accustomed to command. I was reviewing the Academy's curriculum and decided to observe some classes. This discussion about primitive versus advanced weapons is quite timely. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Being noticed by a general was rarely a good thing for a cadet. Varix looked around the room, his ancient eyes taking in each student. You see, we've recently encountered some interesting situations in the Outer Rim territories. Pirates have been using unconventional tactics that have proven surprisingly effective against our standard protocols. Zara-TH raised her hands again. How is that possible, sir? Their technology should be inferior to ours. That's exactly what our field commanders thought, Varix replied. And that assumption cost us 3 ships and 47 good soldiers before we adapted our tactics. The general moved to stand directly in front of Marcus. Cadet Shun, your file indicates you have some experience with what your people call primitive weapons. It wasn't a question. Marcus felt the weight of military intelligence behind those words. Of course, they knew about his background. He had grown up on a frontier colony where hunting and traditional skills were still necessary for survival. His grandfather had been a master bowyer who had taught Marcus the ancient art of crafting bows and arrows from natural materials. Some experience, sir, Marcus admitted carefully. I've been reviewing reports from human colonies, Varix continued. It seems your people maintain proficiency with pre-technological weapons, even after joining the galactic community. Why is that? Marcus thought carefully before answering. This felt like a test, though he wasn't sure of what. Tradition, partly, but also practicality. On frontier worlds, you can't always rely on having spare parts for advanced equipment. Sometimes the old ways are more reliable. Interesting. Varix turned to address the entire class. Let me tell you about the Battle of Kepler Station, a Federation outpost attacked by raiders using nothing but kinetic weapons and chemical explosives. Our defenders were equipped with the latest plasma weaponry, personal shields, and sensor arrays. He paused, letting the anticipation build. The raiders won. The silence that followed was deafening. Thakmar's shell plates shifted nervously. How, sir? They used the station's own infrastructure against us. Cut power to the shield generators. Flooded sections with corrosive atmosphere that damaged our equipment. Forced close-quarters combat in environments where our sensors were useless. Varix's expression was grim. Our people were so dependent on their technology that when it failed, they were helpless. Professor Kethvar's crystalline form seemed to dim slightly. I begin to see your point, General. Do you? Varix asked. Because I'm not sure I do entirely. That's why I'm here. He looked back at Marcus. Cadet Shun, I'm told you've suggested that soldiers should maintain proficiency with primitive weapons. Is that correct? Marcus felt every eye in the room boring into him. This was definitely a test, and he was beginning to suspect it was one that could affect his entire future at the academy. I think soldiers should be adaptable, sir. Technology is a tool, but it's not the only tool. Give me a specific example. Marcus's mind raced. He could feel the skepticism radiating from his classmates. To them, he probably sounded like someone suggesting they fight starships with swords and shields. But there was something in General Varix's manner that suggested this wasn't entirely theoretical. Well, sir, Marcus began slowly, consider a scenario where you need to eliminate a target silently. A plasma weapon might be detected by sensors, or its energy signature might give away your position. But an arrow, he paused, seeing several students roll their eyes. An arrow is just wood and metal. No energy signature. No electronic components to malfunction or be detected. You're talking about assassination, Thakmar said with obvious distaste. Honorable warriors fight openly. With respect, Marcus replied, honorable warriors also try to win with minimal casualties on both sides. Sometimes that means avoiding a fight altogether. General Varix nodded slowly. Continue, cadet. There's also the resource factor. A plasma rifle requires manufactured power cells, precision components, rare elements. An arrow can be made from materials found on almost any world with plant life. If you're stranded or cut off from supply lines, which weapon is more useful? But surely the power difference, Professor Kethvar began. Sir, humans killed animals weighing several tons with arrows. Marcus interrupted respectfully. We hunted creatures with natural armor, enhanced reflexes, and aggressive territorial instincts. The key isn't the power of individual shots, it's understanding anatomy and shot placement. Varix walked to the room's main display panel and activated a holographic projection. It showed a detailed anatomical diagram of a Corvan warrior. Show me where you would place a shot to incapacitate this target non-lethally. The request hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus could feel the tension in the room rashaying up several notches. Thakmar's shell plates were now fully bristled, a clear sign of agitation among his people. Marcus studied the hologram carefully. Corvan physiology was well documented. They were one of the founding members of the Federation. Their natural shell provided excellent protection, but, like any armor, it had weaknesses. Here, Marcus said, pointing to a spot just below the shell's edge near what would be the armpit area. There's a gap in the natural armor where the shell plates meet. An arrow placed there would penetrate muscle tissue and could damage motor nerve clusters without hitting vital organs. Thakmar stood abruptly, his massive frame towering over the classroom. You speak of attacking a Federation citizen. I speak of understanding anatomy, Marcus replied calmly. The same knowledge that helps a medic treat wounds can help a soldier create them efficiently. It's just applied biology. General Varix deactivated the hologram. Sit down, Cadet Thakmar. This is a military academy. We study warfare in all its forms. He turned back to Marcus. That was the correct answer. Few people outside of Corvan medical professionals know about those nerve clusters. Marcus felt a flush of pride, followed immediately by unease. Sir, may I ask why you're testing me on this? Because, Varix said, I'm considering a proposal that would revolutionize Federation military training. I want to establish a new program focusing on unconventional warfare and primitive weapon systems. And I want a human to help design it. The classroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Professor Kitvar Lukidstoniet. General, surely you're not serious about. I'm completely serious. Varix cut him off. The future of warfare isn't just about having the biggest gun. It's about being prepared for every situation, including the ones where your big gun doesn't work. He looked directly at Marcus. Cadet Shun, I'm offering you a choice. You can continue with the standard curriculum and graduate as a competent but conventional officer, or you can help me prove that there's value in the old ways. But I should warn you, if you choose the latter, you'll face significant skepticism from your peers and superiors. Marcus felt his heart rate increase. This was an opportunity beyond anything he had imagined when he applied to the academy. But it was also dangerous. Military institutions were notoriously resistant to change, especially change that challenged fundamental assumptions about modern warfare. What would this program involve, sir? Field testing. We need to demonstrate that primitive weapons and unconventional tactics have practical applications in modern combat scenarios. Varix's expression grew serious. You'd essentially be trying to prove that thousands of years of military evolution haven't rendered your ancestors' methods completely obsolete. And if we fail, then you'll have the shortest and most humiliating military career in Federation history, Varix said bluntly. But if we succeed, we might just save lives by teaching soldiers to think beyond their equipment. Marcus looked around the room at his classmates. Most looked skeptical or amused. A few seemed genuinely curious. Thakmar appeared to be struggling with the concept that his natural armor might not be absolute protection. But it was Professor Kethvar's expression that decided him. The old Vorthak was looking at Marcus with something that might have been respect. Here was someone who had spent his entire career studying warfare from a theoretical perspective, and he was beginning to see the practical wisdom in what Marcus was suggesting. When would you want a demonstration, sir? Marcus asked. General Varix smiled, an expression that looked surprisingly predatory on his crystalline features. How about right now? I understand you claim that primitive weapons can be crafted from available materials. This classroom contains standard academy furniture and basic educational supplies. Could you fashion a functional bow from these resources? The challenge was clear and immediate. Marcus felt his mouth go dry. This wasn't theoretical anymore. Every eye in the room was on him, and his answer would determine not just his own future, but potentially the future of military doctrine for the entire Federation. He looked around the room, taking inventory. Standard desks made from a lightweight but durable polymer composite. Chairs with flexible back supports. A quantum board with a metal frame. Various educational tools and supplies. Yes, sir, Marcus said, standing up. I believe I can. Then do it, Varix ordered. Class is now a practical demonstration. Everyone observe closely. You're about to see either the resurrection of ancient wisdom or a very educational failure. Marcus took a deep breath and walked to the front of the room. Every instinct told him this was either the best decision he would ever make or the worst. But as he began examining the classroom furniture with new eyes, he felt the familiar calm that came from working with his hands. His grandfather had always said that the measure of a true bowyer wasn't how well he could work with perfect materials, but how functional a weapon he could create from whatever was available. Today, Marcus would find out if those lessons had been worth learning. The room fell silent except for the sound of Marcus moving furniture, his movements careful and deliberate. Outside the windows, the twin suns of Zentera Prime continued their eternal dance across an alien sky. But inside the classroom, something much more primal was taking place. The marriage of ancient skill and modern necessity. Marcus ran his fingers along the edge of a desk, testing the flexibility of the polymer composite. The material felt familiar under his touch. Not wood, but something with similar properties. The Federation had designed their furniture to be durable yet lightweight, qualities that could work in his favor. "What exactly are you doing?" asked Zartich, her multiple arms folded in obvious skepticism. "Testing materials," Marcus replied without looking up. "My grandfather taught me that every bow starts with understanding what you're working with. Wood has grain, metal has stress points, synthetic materials have molecular structures. You work with the material, not against it." He moved to one of the chairs and examined the flexible back support. It was made from a different polymer, one designed to bend without breaking under repeated stress. Perfect for what he had in mind. General Varix watched silently from the corner, his ancient eyes taking in every detail. Professor Kethvar had moved closer, his scientific curiosity clearly overriding his skepticism about primitive weapons. The basic principle of a bow, Marcus said as he worked, speaking to the room, but focusing on his task, is storing and releasing energy efficiently. You bend the bow, storing potential energy, then release it to transfer that energy to the projectile. He carefully detached the flexible backing from one of the chairs, running his hands along its length to check for any weak spots or irregularities. The material was uniform and strong, better than some woods he had worked with. But how can furniture possibly compare to manufactured weapons? Thakmar asked, his earlier hostility replaced by genuine curiosity. Marcus looked up briefly. It's not about comparing. It's about adapting. A plasma rifle might be more powerful, but can you make one from scratch if yours breaks? Can you manufacture ammunition for it? Can you maintain it without specialized tools? He turned his attention to the metal framework of the quantum board, testing joints and connections. The frame was made from a lightweight alloy, similar to aluminum but stronger. With some modification, it could provide the structure he needed. The Corvin way teaches that a warrior should master his weapons completely, Thakmar said thoughtfully. But we have never considered the idea of creating weapons from nothing. Not from nothing, Marcus corrected, beginning to carefully disassemble the board frame. From what's available. Humans learned early that resources are limited and situations are unpredictable. The survivors are the ones who could adapt. He worked methodically, his hands moving with the unconscious competence that came from years of practice. The other students watched in fascination as classroom furniture was transformed into something else entirely. There was something almost magical about the process, taking mundane objects and reimagining their purpose. Your people sound quite paranoid, observed a discreet student named Kliktar, her feathers rustling with amusement. Always preparing for disaster. Marcus paused in his work and smiled. There's an old human joke. A pessimist sees a glass half empty, an optimist sees it half full, and an engineer sees a glass that's twice as big as it needs to be. Humans tend to be engineers about survival. Explain, said Professor Kethvar. We don't see paranoia, we see redundancy. We don't see disaster preparation, we see risk management. Marcus resumed working, using the edge of a metal desk component to carefully score the polymer material. On Earth, the civilizations that survived were the ones that had backup plans for their backup plans. General Varix spoke for the first time in several minutes. Show them the statistics, Professor. Kethvar activated his personal display, and holographic numbers filled the air above his crystalline form. Human space colonies have a 97% success rate. The galactic average is 73%. Human exploration missions have an 89% survival rate compared to the galactic average of 61%. The numbers hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus felt uncomfortable being the center of attention, but he could see the impact the statistics had on his classmates. That's because you're naturally suspicious and defensive, Kliktar said, though her tone was less dismissive than before. Maybe, Marcus acknowledged, but we prefer to think of it as being realistic about what can go wrong. Murphy's Law is practically a religious principle for humans. What is this Murphy's Law? Zarth asked. Marcus grinned as he tested the flex of his improvised bow material. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong at the worst possible moment in the worst possible way. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. For species that had evolved on more stable worlds, the concept of constantly expecting catastrophe was alien and somewhat disturbing. But how do you function with such pessimistic thinking? Professor Kethvar asked. It's not pessimistic, it's preparatory, Marcus explained. We hope for the best, but plan for the worst. That way, when things go wrong, and they always do eventually, we're ready to adapt instead of being paralyzed by surprise. He had finished shaping the bow structure and was now working on the critical connections. The joint where the frame met the flexible backing would determine whether his improvised weapon would function or simply fall apart under stress. The Vorthak have a saying, General Varix said quietly. The crystal that bends survives the storm that shatters the crystal that stands rigid. Marcus looked up, surprised to hear philosophy from the old general. That's very similar to something humans say. The tree that bends in the wind survives while the mighty oak gets uprooted. Perhaps our species are not so different after all, Varix mused. Marcus used components from multiple desks to create a makeshift workbench and began the delicate process of stringing his bow. He had no proper bowstring, but the Federation's communication cables were made from advanced synthetic fibers that could work as a substitute. The key was getting the tension exactly right, too loose, and the bow would be ineffective, too tight, and the improvised materials might snap under stress. This is taking considerably longer than simply picking up a plasma rifle, observed Thakmar. True, Marcus admitted, but I'm not just making a weapon. I'm also teaching you the process. In an emergency, you wouldn't need to explain every step. He tested the string tension carefully, making fine adjustments. The bow was starting to take shape, crude by his grandfather's standards, but functional. It wouldn't win any craftsmanship awards, but it would serve its purpose. Now I need projectiles, Marcus said, looking around the room. Arrows, Zarath asked. Anything that's reasonably straight, lightweight, and can fly true. The Federation doesn't exactly stock arrowheads, so I'll have to improvise. He found what he was looking for in the classroom's supply cabinet. Basic measurement rods used for physics demonstrations were made from a dense polymer that would fly well. With some modification, they would work perfectly. The key to an effective arrow, Marcus explained as he worked, isn't just the tip. It's the balance between the head, shaft, and fletching. Everything has to work together for accurate flight. Using small pieces of the flexible material from the chairbacks, he crafted improvised fletching for his arrows. It was delicate work that required patience and precision. In actual combat, Kliktar pointed out, you would not have time for such detailed work. You're absolutely right, Marcus agreed. But you also wouldn't need to create multiple arrows. In a survival situation, you might only get one shot. You want to make it count. He held up his first completed arrow, examining it critically. Not perfect, but it would fly. The balance felt reasonable, and the improvised point was sharp enough to penetrate most materials. One more thing, Marcus said, moving back to the supply cabinet. He emerged with a small container of marking ink used for writing on the quantum boards. For the demonstration? What's that for? Professor Kethvar asked. Safety, Marcus replied. I'm going to dip the arrow tip in this ink. That way, when I hit the target, it will leave a mark without actually penetrating deeply. We can see the accuracy without causing damage. General Varix nodded approvingly. Good thinking. What will your target be? Marcus looked around the room and spotted exactly what he needed. That wall display showing Federation battle formations. See the enemy ship marked in red? That's my target. The display was mounted on the far wall, perhaps 20 meters away. To his classmates, it probably seemed like an easy shot. They had no experience with primitive weapons and didn't understand the variables involved: trajectory, wind resistance, the weight distribution of an improvised arrow. But Marcus could feel the subtle air currents in the room, generated by the ventilation system. He could sense the slight tremor in the floor from the Academy's massive fusion reactors deep underground. Most importantly, he could judge the balance and performance characteristics of his improvised weapon through the tactile feedback in his hands. Before I take this shot, Marcus said, I want to emphasize something important. This isn't about showing off or proving that primitive weapons are superior to modern ones. This is about demonstrating adaptability, about showing that with knowledge, creativity, and skill, someone can create effective tools from available resources. He took his position, drawing the bow experimentally to test the feel. The string cut into his fingers slightly. He would have preferred proper archery gloves, but they weren't available. The draw weight was lighter than he was used to, but sufficient for the distance involved. The first rule of improvised weapons, Marcus continued, is that they're never as good as purpose-built equipment. But sometimes having an imperfect tool is better than having no tool at all. He notched the arrow and drew back the string, feeling the familiar tension build in his shoulders and back. The bow held steady, showing no signs of immediate structural failure. Around him, the classroom had fallen completely silent. "The second rule," Marcus said softly, his voice barely audible as he aimed, "is that skill matters more than equipment. A master archer with a crude bow will outshoot a novice with the finest weapon ever made." He released the arrow in one smooth motion, the string snapping forward with a sharp crack. The improvised projectile flew across the room in a shallow arc, ink-tipped point aimed directly at the red enemy ship's symbol on the display. The arrow struck the target with a satisfying thunk, the ink tip leaving a clear blue mark directly in the center of the enemy ship. The classroom erupted in surprised murmurs and scattered applause. But Marcus wasn't finished. While his classmates were still processing what they had witnessed, he was already notching his second arrow. This time, he aimed for a much smaller target, the command bridge section of the same enemy ship, a target no larger than his thumbnail at that distance. The second arrow flew true, striking just centimeters from the first and leaving another blue mark in precisely the location Marcus had intended. "Show off," he muttered to himself, but he couldn't suppress a small smile of satisfaction. General Varix walked over to examine the target closely. The two blue marks were so close together they almost overlapped, both striking critical areas of the enemy vessel, as marked on the tactical display. "Remarkable accuracy," the general said. "What's the effective range of such a weapon?" Marcus shouldered the improvised bow and considered the question carefully. "With this particular construction, maybe 50 meters for accuracy, 100 meters maximum range. But those numbers would improve significantly with better materials and more time for construction." "And how long did this take you?" Professor Kethvar asked, consulting his chronometer. "About 23 minutes, Marcus replied. "But remember, I was explaining the process as I worked. With practice and the right materials, you can make a functional bow in under 10 minutes. Thakmar approached the target to examine the arrow marks more closely. "The accuracy is impressive, but could such a weapon penetrate modern armor?" Marcus retrieved his arrows from the display, testing the tips to see how much damage the impact had caused. Not energy shields or heavy battle armor, no, but personal protection gear? Definitely. Most modern armor is designed to disperse energy or stop high-velocity projectiles. A relatively slow-moving arrow with a sharp point can sometimes slip between plates or find gaps that energy weapons can't exploit. He demonstrated by pointing to various locations on Thakmar's natural shell armor. The same weak points I identified earlier would be vulnerable to arrow attack. The key is precision, not power. Zarath raised two of her hands. "But what about the time factor? In combat, speed matters more than craftsmanship." "Absolutely true," Marcus agreed. "But consider different scenarios. What if you're not in active combat? What if you're stranded on an uninhabited planet and need to hunt for food? What if you're operating behind enemy lines and need a silent weapon? What if your mission requires you to eliminate targets without alerting nearby sensors?" He gestured to his improvised bow. "This weapon makes no energy signature. It produces minimal noise. The projectiles can be recovered and reused. And most importantly, it can be manufactured from materials available on almost any inhabited world." General Varix had been listening intently to the entire discussion. Now he stepped forward, his crystalline features reflecting the classroom's artificial lighting. "Cadet Chun, what you've demonstrated today confirms what I suspected. Federation military doctrine has become too dependent on advanced technology. We've forgotten that warfare is ultimately about adapting to circumstances and overcoming obstacles with available resources." The old general looked around at the assembled students. "How many of you could create a functional weapon if your equipment was destroyed or lost? How many of you could survive for more than a few days on an uninhabited planet without technological support? How many of you could complete a mission using only your knowledge and improvised tools?" The silence that followed was telling. These were some of the brightest military students in the galaxy, trained in the use of the most advanced weapon systems ever created. But faced with the prospect of primitive survival, they were clearly out of their depth. This is why, Varix continued, I'm implementing the new unconventional warfare program, not to replace modern military training, but to supplement it, to ensure that Federation officers can adapt and overcome regardless of circumstances. Marcus felt a surge of pride and anxiety in equal measure. This was what he had hoped for, but the responsibility was enormous. He would essentially be attempting to prove that human survival instincts and primitive skills had value in a technologically advanced military organization. There will be challenges, Varix warned, seeming to read Marcus's thoughts. Many officers will see this training as a waste of time. Some will view it as an insult to suggest that they need to learn primitive skills. You'll face resistance, skepticism, and quite possibly ridicule. The general paused, letting his words sink in. But you'll also have my full support and the authority to design training scenarios that test these concepts in realistic situations. If you can prove the value of unconventional tactics and improvised weapons, you'll revolutionize how the Federation approaches military training. Marcus looked around at his classmates, seeing a mixture of expressions. Some still looked skeptical, others seemed intrigued, and a few appeared genuinely excited by the possibilities. Professor Kethvar was examining the improvised bow with obvious scientific interest. Sir, Marcus said carefully, what exactly would this program involve? General Varix smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both encouraging and terrifying. Field exercises. Real scenarios where conventional equipment fails or is unavailable. Survival situations that require creative problem-solving. Combat scenarios against opponents using unconventional tactics. The general's expression grew more serious. And, eventually, if the program shows promise, real missions. The kind where having backup skills might mean the difference between success and disaster. Marcus felt his heart rate increase again. This was moving faster than he had anticipated. Just hours ago, he had been a regular cadet sitting in a weapons theory class. Now he was being offered the chance to reshape Federation military doctrine. When would this program begin? He asked. Immediately, Varix replied. I've already arranged for a special training facility to be prepared. You'll have access to various environments and scenarios designed to test unconventional tactics. You'll also have a team of volunteers from different species who are interested in learning these skills. The general looked directly at each student in the room. In fact, I'm hoping some of your classmates might be interested in participating. This program will require people from different backgrounds and with different natural abilities. Thakmar surprised everyone by speaking first. I would be interested in learning more about these weak points you mentioned. If such knowledge could make me a more effective warrior, I should master it. Zarath's multiple arms gestured uncertainty. The Nexri military values adaptation and multiple approaches to problems. This could be valuable training. Even Kliktar seemed intrigued. The Skreet are natural hunters. Perhaps there are techniques we have forgotten that could be relearned. Professor Kethvar set down the improvised bow he had been examining. From a scientific perspective, this represents a fascinating study in applied materials science and emergency engineering. I would like to observe the training, if possible. General Varix nodded approvingly. Excellent. This confirms my belief that good ideas can come from anywhere and that the best military units are those that combine different perspectives and abilities. Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension as he realized what he was committing to. This was an opportunity to prove that human adaptability and survival skills had value beyond Earth, but it was also a tremendous responsibility. If the program failed, it would reflect poorly not just on him, but on humanity's reputation within the Federation. But as he looked at the improvised bow in his hands and the blue ink marks on the target across the room, he felt a quiet confidence. His grandfather had always said that the best way to honor old knowledge was to find new applications for it. Today, Marcus had done exactly that. The afternoon sun of Zentera Prime was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the classroom windows. But inside the room, something new was beginning. Old knowledge was meeting new challenges, and the result promised to change everything. 6 months later, Marcus stood on the observation deck of the training station orbiting Kepler 442b, watching his students prepare for their final examination. The facility had been built specifically for the unconventional warfare program, featuring multiple environments that could simulate everything from Arctic tundra to dense jungle to urban ruins. Below him, through the reinforced transparent steel windows, he could see his team of 12 students moving through the Broken City scenario, a mock urban environment where all advanced technology had been rendered inoperable by electromagnetic pulse weapons. They had been dropped into the scenario 3 days ago with nothing but basic clothing and their knowledge. The students were an impressive mix of species and backgrounds. Thakmar had proven to be a natural student of improvised weapons, his Corvan strength allowing him to craft tools that would have been impossible for smaller species. Zarth's multiple arms gave her unparalleled ability to work with complex constructions, and she had become the team's expert in improvised electronics and communication devices. Kliktar had embraced her species' hunting heritage, combining discreet aerial reconnaissance abilities with primitive tracking skills to become an exceptional scout. Even some students from other classes had volunteered for the program after word of their successes had spread through the academy. "They're doing well," observed General Varix, joining Marcus at the observation window. The old Vorthak had become a regular visitor to the training facility, partly to monitor the program's progress, and partly because he seemed genuinely fascinated by what the students were accomplishing. Marcus nodded, watching as Thakmar used a length of salvage cable and pieces of debris to construct what appeared to be a ballista-style siege engine. "Better than I expected, honestly. When we started, I wasn't sure if species from more stable worlds could adapt to this kind of thinking. And now I think the problem isn't capability, it's mindset. Once they accept that technology can fail and that improvisation is a valuable skill rather than a sign of inadequacy, they pick it up quickly." On the surface below, Marcus could see Zarth working with 2 other students to create what looked like an improvised radio using components salvaged from damaged equipment. They had discovered that while the EMP had destroyed most electronic devices, some basic components could still function if rewired properly. "The Federation Command is taking notice," Varix said quietly. "Your program has been mentioned in 3 separate strategic planning sessions this month." Marcus felt a familiar mix of pride and anxiety. Good mentions or bad mentions? Mixed, as you'd expect. Admiral Krell still thinks the entire program is a waste of resources. Admiral Scythen wants to know if these techniques could be implemented fleet-wide. Admiral Vaughn is concerned about the implications for military procurement if soldiers can fight effectively with improvised weapons. That last concern was one Marcus hadn't considered. If soldiers could create effective weapons from available materials, would that reduce the military's dependence on advanced manufacturing? Would weapons contractors see the program as a threat to their profits? "Politics," Marcus said with a slight grimace. "Everything is politics at this level," Varix replied. "But don't let that concern you. Focus on results. If your program produces better soldiers, the politics will sort themselves out." Below them, the scenario was entering its critical phase. The students had been tasked with rescuing hostages from a fortified position while avoiding detection by automated sensor systems. The twist was that all of their conventional equipment had been rendered useless, forcing them to rely entirely on improvised tools and primitive tactics. Marcus watched through electronic surveillance feeds as his students put their training into practice. Kliktar was providing aerial reconnaissance, using her natural flight abilities to scout the target building without triggering sensors calibrated to detect mechanical aircraft. Her reports were being relayed through an improvised communication system that Zarth had constructed from salvaged components. Meanwhile, Thakmar was leading a ground team armed with weapons they had crafted over the past 3 days. The Corvan warrior carried a massive, improvised crossbow that could punch through light armor, while the other team members carried an assortment of bows, slings, and improvised explosives. The sensor systems aren't detecting them, noted Captain Korth, the Nexury officer who served as the scenario's tactical controller. Energy weapons would have triggered multiple alerts by now, but primitive kinetic weapons don't register on the detection grid. Marcus nodded. That had been one of the key points of the exercise, demonstrating that sometimes the old ways were invisible to modern defenses. Automated systems were programmed to detect energy signatures, electronic emissions, and specific threat patterns. A human with a bow and arrow simply didn't register as a military threat to most sensor arrays. Beginning infiltration phase came Clicktar's voice over the improvised radio system. No movement detected in the target structure. Automated sentries are active, but not alerting. The students moved like shadows through the mock urban environment, using cover and concealment techniques that predated spaceflight by thousands of years. It was remarkable to watch species that had evolved on different worlds adapting hunting and stalking tactics that were fundamentally universal. "Contact front," whispered one of the team members, a Vorthack student named Krextau. Two automated sentries, position marked. Through the surveillance feeds, Marcus could see the problem. Two automated gun turrets were covering the approach to the building where the hostages were being held. The turrets were programmed to respond to movement, energy signatures, and metal detection. Conventional tactics would require either heavy weapons to destroy them or sophisticated electronic warfare to disable them. Instead, he watched as Thakmar and another student used a technique they had developed during training. They approached the sentries from an angle that kept them in the sensor's blind spots, then used improvised grappling hooks to scale the building and attack the turret from above with simple hammers and pry bars. The turrets, programmed to expect sophisticated threats, never detected the primitive assault until it was too late. Within minutes, both automated weapons were offline, disabled by the application of brute force to their mechanical components. "Ingenious," murmured General Varix. "They've identified a fundamental weakness in our defense systems. Automated turrets assume that threats will be technologically sophisticated." "That's the point," Marcus replied. "We've become so focused on defending against advanced attacks that we've left ourselves vulnerable to simple ones. It's like installing an electronic lock on your door, but leaving the window open." The infiltration continued with the team moving into the target building. The scenario had been designed to test not just their ability to craft improvised weapons, but also their skill at silent movement, lock-picking, and close-quarters combat without energy weapons. Marcus watched with professional interest as his students navigated these challenges. Clicktar's natural flight abilities made her perfect for reaching upper-floor windows, while Thakmar's strength allowed him to simply tear through barriers that would have stopped other species. "Hostiles identified," came the whispered report. 4 guards, armed with standard plasma rifles. They're positioned to cover the main approaches. This was the critical test. How would his students handle opponents with superior firepower when they were limited to primitive weapons? The answer came quickly and demonstrated just how much they had learned. Instead of engaging the guards directly, the team used misdirection and environmental manipulation. They created distractions on the opposite side of the building, drawing the guards away from their defensive positions. Then, they used smoke screens created from improvised chemical mixtures to obscure visibility and confuse targeting systems. When the actual confrontation came, it was swift and decisive. The guards, trained to fight opponents with similar equipment, were unprepared for the reality of facing silent arrows and sling stones coming from unexpected angles. Their plasma rifles were powerful, but useless against enemies they couldn't see or predict. "All hostiles down, beginning extraction," reported Krextau. "Hostages secured." The exercise concluded with the successful extraction of all simulated hostages and the team's retreat to their designated extraction point. Total time elapsed, 6 hours and 17 minutes. Casualties among the students, 0. Casualties among the opposition. For guards, neutralized non-lethally. "Impressive," said Captain Korth as the scenario ended, and the students began their post-mission debriefing. I've seen conventional military units take twice as long to complete similar objectives, and usually with higher casualty rates. Marcus felt a surge of pride in his students, but he kept his expression neutral. Success in training was one thing. Success in actual combat was something else entirely. But the results were encouraging enough that he was beginning to believe his program might actually have lasting value. "There's something else you should know," General Varix said as they watched the students emerge from the training facility. "We've received a request for your team to participate in a real mission." Marcus turned sharply. "Real combat. Not combat exactly, but not training either." Varix activated a holographic display showing a star system Marcus didn't recognize. "3 weeks ago, we lost contact with a survey team on Helios 7. Their last transmission indicated equipment failures across multiple systems due to some kind of atmospheric interference. The implications were immediately clear. You want us to find them. We want you to find them using only equipment that won't be affected by whatever caused their systems to fail. That means no advanced electronics, no energy weapons, no quantum communicators. Just basic tools and your training." Marcus stared at the holographic display, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't a training exercise with safety protocols and backup systems. This was real people in real danger, depending on skills that most of the galaxy considered obsolete. "What kind of atmospheric interference?" he asked. "Unknown. The science team's preliminary analysis suggested some kind of natural electromagnetic phenomenon, but they lost contact before they could provide detailed data. So we'd be going in blind." "Essentially, yes. Which is exactly why conventional rescue teams haven't been sent. The risk of losing more people to equipment failure is too high." Marcus looked down at his students as they conducted their post-mission debriefing. They had performed excellently in training, but training and reality were very different things. Was he really prepared to risk their lives on an improving concept? "How long do we have to decide?" he asked. "The mission launches in 72 hours. If your team isn't ready, we'll have to consider other options." Varix paused. "But, Marcus, there may not be other options. This is exactly the kind of scenario your program was designed for." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and planning. Marcus found himself revisiting every aspect of the unconventional warfare curriculum, trying to anticipate what challenges they might face on Helios 7. The mission would test not just their combat skills, but their ability to survive in an unknown environment with minimal technology. The team that finally assembled for departure was different from the one that had started training 6 months earlier. They moved with the quiet confidence that came from mastering difficult skills under pressure. Their equipment loadout would have looked bizarre to conventional military units: bows, knives, rope, basic medical supplies, and containers for collecting water and food. "You sure about this, Marcus?" asked Thakmar as they prepared to board the transport that would take them to Helios 7. "If this mission fails, they'll use it as justification to shut down the entire program." Marcus looked around at his team: humans, Corvin, Nexuri, Vorthak, and Screet, all united by training that emphasized adaptability over technology. "I'm sure," he said. "Not because I know we'll succeed, but because I know we're prepared for whatever we find." The transport ship that carried them to Helios 7 was stripped of all non-essential electronics, operating with backup navigation systems and manual controls. As they approached the planet, Marcus could see why conventional rescue attempts had failed. Helios 7 was surrounded by a shimmering aurora that extended far beyond its atmosphere, creating a spectacular but ominous light show that interfered with most sensor systems. The pilot had to rely on visual navigation to find a safe landing site. "Whatever's causing that," observed Zardich, "it's like nothing we've encountered before." The landing was rough, but successful, bringing them down in a forest clearing approximately 50 kilometers from the survey team's last known position. As soon as they stepped off the transport, Marcus could feel the electromagnetic interference as a subtle tingling in the air. "Communications are down," reported Krextal, testing his backup radio. Whatever's causing the interference, it's even stronger on the surface. Marcus nodded. They had expected this and planned accordingly. We proceed as planned. Standard tracking formation. Maintain visual contact. Use improvised signals for communication. What followed was a demonstration of everything they had learned over the past 6 months. Moving through alien terrain without GPS or electronic navigation systems, tracking signs of human passage using primitive techniques, and adapting to unexpected challenges with improvised solutions. They found the survey team's base camp on the second day, abandoned but intact. Evidence suggested the team had left in a hurry, but there were no signs of violence or struggle. More importantly, there were clear tracks leading deeper into the forest. They went that way, announced Clicktar after conducting an aerial reconnaissance, following what looks like a game trail toward higher elevation. The trail led them through increasingly difficult terrain, but it also provided clues about what had happened to the survey team. Abandoned equipment told the story of people whose technology was failing and who were making difficult decisions about what to carry and what to leave behind. They're smart, observed Thakmar, examining a discarded scanner. They're traveling light and leaving us a trail to follow. On the third day, they found them. The survey team had taken shelter in a natural cave system, using manual techniques to create a defensible position and maintain basic life support. They had adapted to the electromagnetic interference by reverting to pre-technological survival methods, much like Marcus's team had trained to do. Federation Rescue Team. Marcus called out as they approached the cave. "We're here to get you home." The reunion was emotional but brief. The survey team was in good condition, but eager to leave a planet that had proven hostile to their equipment. More importantly, they had valuable scientific data about the electromagnetic phenomenon that was causing the interference. "It's a natural occurrence," explained Dr. Sarah Chun, the team's lead scientist and, coincidentally, Marcus's cousin. "The planet's core contains deposits of a mineral that creates powerful electromagnetic pulses during certain atmospheric conditions. It's like a natural EMP generator. The extraction was completed without incident, demonstrating that primitive skills and improvised equipment could succeed where advanced technology had failed. More importantly, it proved that the unconventional warfare program had real value beyond training scenarios." 6 months later, Marcus stood before a panel of Federation admirals, delivering his final report on the program's effectiveness. The rescue mission on Helios 7 had been followed by several other successful operations, each one demonstrating different applications of unconventional tactics. In conclusion, Marcus said, addressing the assembled officers, "The unconventional warfare program has proven that primitive skills and improvised weapons retain significant value in modern military operations, not as replacements for advanced technology, but as essential backup capabilities for situations where conventional approaches fail." Admiral Krell, who had been the program's most vocal critic, leaned forward in his chair. "Cadet Chun, are you suggesting that we should train all Federation officers in these primitive techniques?" "No, sir," Marcus replied. "I'm suggesting that we should train enough officers in these techniques to ensure that we always have options when conventional approaches aren't available." Admiral Scythen nodded approvingly. "The program has demonstrated clear tactical advantages in specific scenarios. I recommend implementation across all military training academies." The final vote was unanimous. The unconventional warfare program would become a permanent part of Federation military education, with Marcus promoted to the rank of lieutenant and assigned to oversee its expansion. As he left the briefing room, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. It had started with a simple demonstration in a classroom, proving that a bow could be crafted from furniture. But it had become something much larger, a recognition that knowledge and adaptability were more valuable than any single piece of technology. His grandfather would have been proud. The old ways had found new purpose among the stars, ensuring that no matter how far humanity traveled or how advanced their technology became, they would never forget the fundamental skills that had allowed them to survive and thrive. The future of warfare wouldn't be determined solely by who had the biggest guns or the most advanced technology. It would be won by those who could adapt, improvise, and overcome regardless of circumstances. And that was a lesson that could benefit not just humans, but every species in the galaxy. Marcus smiled as he walked through the corridors of Federation Command, already planning the next phase of training. There were new worlds to explore, new challenges to face, and new students to teach that sometimes the oldest solutions were exactly what the future needed.